us in the back. You stabbed us in the back one too many times.
There's this idea that communism has killed 100 million people. The claim comes from the Black Book of Communism, a history published in 1997 by Stéphane Courtois and others. If we're going to get specific, the claim is that communism has killed more than 94 million people. And I get that that's just a matter of rounding, but 6 million people is not insignificant. The biggest numbers, of course, come from the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. And how did these 94 million die? Executions, famine, war, deportations, and forced labor. Of course, none of these things are unique to communism, and in fact seem to thrive in societies that don't practice communism at all. I mean, just in 2020, nearly 400,000 US Americans have died from COVID because of the way capitalism has denied healthcare and living wages to so many. This is more than twice as much as the book claims died from communism in Latin America in the last century. And anyway, what the book calls communism is more accurately described as Marxism-Leninism, an ideology developed by neither Marx nor Lenin. And that may feel like a trivial distinction, but since communism describes a classless, moneyless, stateless society, Marxism-Leninism isn't really communism so much as an alleged attempt to transition to communism, which admittedly has never borne fruit. And don't get me wrong, these 94 million deaths are a huge tragedy, and no excuses or apologetics should be made for their killers. But when the reality is that 94 million people have died from kinda, sorta, not really communist regimes, communism has killed 100 million? Starts to feel suspiciously imprecise. Ask a critic of communism what it is that they hate so much, and they'll probably give you a few answers. Breadlines, too many resources being spread too thin, an exploited labor class with barely enough to survive, and a ruling class, a powerful few that make all the decisions for the working poor. Well, newsflash, that stuff isn't exclusive to communism. In fact, I think you'd have a hard time arguing that any of these things are results of communism. Because, again, communism traditionally describes a cashless, classless, and stateless society. So, no nation-state can ever have been truly communist, and certainly not any authoritarian states. But I do get it. Plenty of authoritarian governments have co-opted the label of communist. Of course, the shining example these days is the Chinese Communist Party. So, I guess linguistically, there is some merit there. But why do we let them decide what communism is? We don't extend the same courtesy to the Christian Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, or to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In fact, didn't George Orwell write a whole novel about how fascists will call themselves something positive to disguise their fascism? So, why is this bastardized understanding of communism so common in the US? Why do we allow foreign authoritarians to dictate our language? Well, perhaps it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what authoritarianism is. Let's look at a prime example of today's right-wing intellectual class, Mr. Ben Shapiro. So, how does he feel about authoritarianism? Well, fortunately for us, Mr. Shapiro took a political compass test for the world to see. If you're not familiar with the political compass, it's pretty straightforward. The x-axis is the one you're probably most familiar with, a simple left-to-right economic scale. The political compass adds to this a second axis, which basically measures the amount of liberty or authority a person prefers. Bear in mind this is a global scale, so most of US mainstream politics falls in the auth-right quadrant. And yes, that includes Democrats.
If the scale is correct in any way, I will end up in the right libertarian category. I mean, that's obviously where I am.
And here's how he did.
Let's see where I stand. It says that I am right libertarian, right, which is true. It says that I'm 6.13 on the economic right, and on the libertarian versus authoritarian score, I am slightly more libertarian. I'm negative 0.72 on that score.
Technically, he wasn't wrong. He does end up in the right libertarian quadrant, although just barely. This places him much closer to Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders than it does to the most die-hard libertarians. Setting aside the imperfections of the political compass, it is just an online test after all. How can such a true libertarian be evaluated as barely a libertarian at all?
Pornography depicting consenting adults should be legal for the adult population. It depends who is doing the regulation. So my general answer is disagree. I don't think that it should be legal, but I think that it's very difficult to draw regulation that is not too heavy-handed in this area.
In fairness, Shapiro does go back to this question and change his answer to agree. But it's more than a little unusual that a self-proclaimed libertarian would spend so much time hemming and hawing over whether a government should ban porn. And that's not all.
Abortion, when the woman's life is not threatened, should always be illegal. Strongly agree. In criminal justice, punishment should be more important than rehabilitation. Agree. The death penalty should be an option for the most serious crimes. Strongly agree.
Ben Shapiro's definition of liberty seems to be, I can do whatever I want, and also you can do whatever I want. And he says almost exactly that in this interview.
As a religious person, I believe that God didn't create stupid rules. So if you believe that God didn't create stupid rules, then you have to come up with some sort of justification for the rules that are being expressed.
Shapiro admits that God doesn't make stupid rules, so we may not know the reason behind God's law, but the law is what the law is. Which is like basically the dictionary definition of arbitrary.
If your chief citation to your opposition to gay marriage is Leviticus 18:22, I don't think that that's a solid argument that's going to convince a lot of people.
Right.
So Mr. Shapiro, understanding that the Torah isn't a legally binding text, believes it is his job to contextualize his arbitrary worldview. And yeah, Mr. Shapiro here doesn't represent all right-wingers or even all conservatives, but he's certainly one of the most prominent conservative pundits, especially in digital media. And here he is, just admitting that his ethical worldview comes uncritically from a text that was written thousands of years ago. His beliefs come first, and the rationale comes second. Which, yeah, fine. Most people probably operate that way. It's probably just how the human brain works. But this is why it's important. Shapiro considers himself a libertarian, and in all fairness, he's not the most authoritarian. But his idea of liberty is you can do whatever you want, as long as it's okay with me. Sounds pretty authoritarian, huh? And the reason I'm spending so much time focusing on the conservative failure to understand the liberty-authority spectrum is because I think this failure is inherent to the way our society views communism. Again, one of the defining features of communism is statelessness. Communism, in theory, is one of the most libertarian political systems. And yet, it's often conflated with extreme authoritarianism. This intentional confusion of liberty and authority seems to be crucial to the contemporary conservative. Those who claim to favor small government seem to actually favor government that's exactly as big as I want it. And I think that's why communism is so scary. Communism, not Marxism-Leninism, but communism, represents small government, as well as individual freedom, as well as an end to wealth inequality. So maybe conservatives don't hate communism because they hate authority, but because they're actually not too wild about liberty. In terms of government, a libertarian like Mr. Shapiro actually prefers a much bigger government than someone like me. And I don't know if I'd call myself a communist necessarily, but I'm certainly closer to communism than he is, right? But also, we're about the same distance from Stalin, who I'm sure Shapiro would call a communist. And his biggest problem with communism is, of course, the authoritarianism, right? I mean, that's what I hate about Stalin. But again, Shapiro tends to be more or less on board when it comes to authoritarianism on the right. He was a pretty lukewarm advocate of Donald Trump, the president who attacked protesters, insulted activists, undermined the free press, used his position to promote the Christian faith, and hugely expanded the power of the presidency. But for Shapiro, that authoritarianism is worth it as long as it allows for the promotion of conservative ideals.
The reason I didn't vote for him in 2016 is because I feared the damage he would do to the social fabric, and I also didn't think he was going to govern conservative because I didn't see a lot of indicators of that. He's governed a lot more conservative than I thought he was going to. And as far as the damage to the social fabric, if he's already done it, I'm not actually mitigating against the damage to the social fabric by not voting for him in 2020.
Because in his words, the damage has already been done. Granted, this was before the 400,000 COVID deaths, but it's not like he has gone back on his support for Trump. Even near the end of Trump's term, Shapiro had a pretty favorable opinion of the hyper-authoritarian.
President Trump, I think, is a B president. Now, I think in terms of policy, he'd be closer to an A. I think in rhetoric, the problem is that he's really been self-defeating.
Also worth mentioning that in the same video, Ben Small Government Shapiro praises Thomas Jefferson for expanding the presidency beyond the authorities granted in the Constitution.
Also, the Louisiana Purchase, which is one of those weird moments in American history where he saw a good deal, recognized he didn't have the constitutional authority to make it, and then went ahead and made it anyway.
This right-wing conflation of liberty and authority gives conservatives an excuse to practice authoritarianism in the name of liberty. So I don't buy it that the US, and especially conservatives, hates communism because it's too authoritarian. I think it's just that it's too left-wing. Communism has never worked, right? Well, yeah, maybe, I guess. I mean, I've known it to work, but granted, that was in a community of less than a dozen people. So maybe communism just doesn't work on a national scale. I mean, no nation-state has ever got into communism, and those that have tried have been single-party authoritarian regimes. But I think you could argue that single-party nations never work, period, whether they're communist or not. I mean, China's doing well economically, but also the whole genocide thing. And also, China isn't communist. The insistence that communism has never worked ignores the fact that we live in an entirely different world than that of the Soviet Union. So it's worth asking, in 2021, is this working? The US is vehemently anti-communist, but still fairly authoritarian. And yet, we've got 500,000 homeless people in the US, but 34 times as many vacant homes. During the pandemic, the working class lost a total of $3.7 trillion, while billionaires gained $3.9 trillion. And when those working class decided to participate in the same system as Wall Street, the financial sector shut it down immediately. Is this working? Is capitalism working? Working in theory, but not practice, is kind of capitalism's whole thing. But working in practice is also kind of an absurd standard. Sure, pure communism has never been practiced on a national scale, but what economic system has ever existed in a pure form? Communism is an ideology that values liberty and well-being above the accumulation of wealth, and I fail to see how that's a bad thing. Hating Marxist communism because it's only been used for subjugation is kind of like blaming Marie Curie for the atomic bomb. Marx and Curie were both academics who published significant studies in their respective fields, and both were dead long before their work could be adopted, built upon, and bastardized by geopolitics. In any case, no ideology has ever been implemented 100% true to theory. And it's not like we're going to flip a switch and adopt communism overnight. So then what's so wrong with having a pure set of ideals? Ben Shapiro is governmentally a libertarian, but his own moral code is incredibly strict. He's made an entire career out of pretending trans people don't exist just because they don't fit neatly into his literally ancient worldview. I mean, communists are often accused of being impossibly utopian, but what's more utopian than using the word of God to govern? And rather than religious text, communists tend to be more interested in history and economic theory. So, just like Ben Shapiro, shouldn't we be able to hold one set of ideals while recognizing that true liberty prevents us from pushing those ideals on others without their consent? Because really, that's what this authority-liberty spectrum is all about. Are you willing to strip liberty from others to advance your ideals? I would, of course, say no. Stalin or even Trump would definitely say yes. I guess it's just weird that someone who loves liberty so much would fall somewhere in between.
Really, it makes no difference to me. She is an adult human. She can do whatever she wants. It is a free country. However,